The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the silence of a village sleeping beneath winter stars, or the hush that falls over a tavern when the last candle gutters out. This was the silence that precedes something. The kind that presses against your ears like wool soaked in cold water, that makes the hairs along your arms rise one by one, that tells your body what your mind refuses to accept. Something was wrong in the Thornfield Road. I had been carrying 2 iron pots of stew from the back kitchen of the Crow and Kettle Tavern to the outer tables, the long wooden benches set up beyond the courtyard wall where travelers ate before continuing toward the capital. When I felt it, the air changed. It thickened, like broth left too long over the fire, like the moment before a storm breaks over the hills and every living creature goes still. I set the pots down on the edge of the courtyard wall and looked toward the forest road. Nothing moved. The pines that lined the Thornfield path were old and enormous, their roots surfacing through the earth like the knuckles of ancient giants. Fog clung to the lower trunks even in the mid-morning hours, which was common for this valley in the autumn months. But the fog was behaving strangely now, curling inward rather than drifting, pulling toward the shadows between the trees as though something on the other side was drawing breath. I told myself it was the wind. I always told myself things like that. My name is Alice, and I have been a serving girl at the Crow and Kettle for 4 years, since I was 22, and arrived at the edge of Vernholt village with a torn traveling cloak, worn boots, and the kind of face that made people decide immediately that I was nobody worth worrying about. Pale skin, a long blonde braid that forever came loose at the temples no matter how tightly I pinned it, and eyes that were too wide and too light to be trusted by anyone in a kingdom where power was measured in darkness and dominance. I was an Omega. There was no hiding it, and I had long since stopped trying. In the hierarchy of this world, Omegas stood at the very bottom, beneath the servants, beneath the Betas who managed households and trade routes, far beneath the Gammas who served as soldiers and scouts, and impossibly distant from the Alphas who ruled territories, commanded armies, and smelled of authority the way pine forests smelled of resin. And above all Alphas, there was only one, the Alpha King himself, whose name people spoke carefully, as though the syllables themselves carried weight. Caius. I had never seen him. I had no reason to ever see him. Kings and their courts did not stop at village taverns along the Thornfield Road. They used the northern passage, wider, smoother, lined with the banners of allied houses and guarded at every league. So when the fog between the pines shifted and I heard the distant sound of hooves, not one horse, not 2, but many, moving in the organized rhythm of a disciplined column, my first thought was not the king is coming. My first thought was, raiders. I grabbed the iron ladle still hanging from my apron cord and turned back toward the tavern door to warn Marta, the head cook, and the woman who had given me a pallet and a purpose when I had no other options. But I had barely taken 3 steps when I heard the second sound. It came from inside the stables. A low, rough snarl, the kind that doesn't come from a frightened animal, but from a cornered one, followed by the crash of something heavy against wood. Then a voice, low and vicious, threaded with the unmistakable snarl cadence of an alpha asserting dominance over someone who had no means to resist it. You'll hand over the grain stores, or we'll take what we want from this whole cursed place. I stopped walking. My heart was beating very fast and very loud, which was inconvenient, because I needed to think clearly. There were 3 men in those stables. I had seen them arrive just before dawn, before the rest of the village stirred. They had the look of men who traveled without purpose, except the kind that ends badly for whoever is nearby. Their horses were branded with no lord's mark. Their armor was mismatched, pieces taken from others, not earned. I had served them bread and watered ale without meeting their eyes, and I had said nothing when I noticed them moving toward the grain cellar with a measuring look that made my stomach drop. I should have said something then. Inside the stable, I heard old Brennan, the tavern keeper, 60 years old with a bad leg, and the disposition of a man who had survived too much to be afraid of most things, make a sound that told me he was afraid now. I looked down at the iron ladle in my hand. I looked at the stable door. I thought about Marta, who was inside the kitchen and did not yet know. About the two young stable boys, Pip and Rennet, who were almost certainly still in there somewhere, hiding behind the horses. About the grain stores, which were everyone's grain stores. The village had pooled resources through the autumn harvest specifically so no one would go hungry when the snow came. I thought about all the reasons I should go inside and wake the others, and let someone else handle it. Then I heard Brennan make that sound again, and I pushed open the stable door. The three men were large, the way men are when they have spent years taking from others rather than building anything. The nearest one had a knife drawn. The second held Brennan by the collar of his tunic, pressing him back against the grain cellar door with casual, contemptuous force. The third was watching the stable entrance, and he was the one who saw me first. He looked at me the way people always looked at me, with immediate dismissal. "Go back inside, little Omega," he said, almost bored. "This doesn't concern you." I gripped the ladle tighter. "This is the Crow and Kettle," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "You were offered bread and ale at fair price this morning. You've had your welcome. I'd like you to leave now." The one holding Brennan laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what?" I didn't have a good answer to that. I had an iron ladle, a gray wool cloak, and 4 years of carrying heavy pots through a crowded tavern, which had given me arms that were stronger than they looked. What I did not have was rank, authority, an alpha's command voice, or any of the things that made people listen. What I had instead was the absolute certainty that if I stepped back through that door, something would happen to Brennan and Pip and Rennet that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. So I didn't step back. I threw the ladle, hard, directly at the hand holding Brennan's collar. And then I grabbed the wooden rake from the wall beside the door, and I held it like I knew how to use it, which I mostly did not, and I planted my feet on the stable floor and looked all three of them in the eyes. "Leave," I said again. "Now." For one absurd, suspended moment, nobody moved. Then the one I'd struck swore loudly and shoved Brennan aside, and all three of them turned toward me with the particular attention of men who have decided that a problem needs to be removed rather than avoided. I did not let myself think. I swung. What happened in the next few moments was not graceful or heroic. It was desperate and loud, and involved a great deal of broken equipment, and at least one overturned water trough. I caught one man across the shoulder with the rake handle. I took a blow to my left side that knocked the air from my lungs and sent me stumbling into the stall wall. I found my footing. I kept moving. I was not winning. I was also not losing, not yet, which under the circumstances felt like something. And then the stable door burst fully open, not from the inside, from outside. Cold morning air poured in, and with it came light, and in that light stood a silhouette so enormous that for one disoriented moment I thought I was looking at a war horse rearing up on its hind legs. But it was a man. Black braided hair, armor of dark leather crossed with iron buckles, a fur mantle across shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe. Eyes so blue and so still and so cold that the temperature in the stable seemed to drop 10 degrees simply from the direction of his gaze. He looked at the three raiders. He looked at me, and something passed across his face. Something unreadable and sharp and there and gone in less than a heartbeat. As he took in the scene, the overturned trough, the broken rake handle in my white-knuckled grip, the three men, and the one small, winded, very much not winning Omega, who had apparently decided to stand her ground anyway. Behind him, I could see the courtyard filled with soldiers. Dozens of them, in formation, bearing the standard of the crown. The silence that followed was absolute. Then one of the raiders, the one who had called me Little Omega, took a slow step backward and said, very quietly, with the specific tone of a man who has just understood that he has made a catastrophic error in judgment, "My lord." Nobody moved for a long moment. The three raiders stood frozen in the center of the stable, and I stood against the wall with splinters in my palm, and my breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls, and the man in the doorway, The man whose very presence had turned every living thing in that courtyard into a statue, did not move at all. He was looking at me, not at the raiders, not at Brennan, who had pressed himself flat against the grain cellar door with his hand over his chest, not at Pip and Rennet, who I could now see huddled in the far corner behind the largest draft horse, their eyes enormous above their tucked knees. At me. I did not know what to do with that, so I did what I always did when powerful people looked at me for too long. I looked away first. "Take them," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. 2 words. That was all. And within moments 4 of his soldiers had moved past him into the stable, efficiently and without drama relieving the 3 raiders of their weapons and escorting them, if escorting was the right word for something that looked more like being lifted by the collar, out into the courtyard. Brennan exhaled. Pip made a small, involuntary sound of relief. Rennet started crying silently, the way boys do when they've been holding it in for too long. I set the broken rake handle down against the wall. My hands were shaking. I noticed this the way you notice a crack in a ceiling. Distantly, as information, without yet understanding what it means structurally. The shaking was fine. The shaking could happen now. The situation was resolved. There was no longer a reason to be useful, which meant my body had apparently decided this was an appropriate moment to remind me of all the things I had not allowed myself to feel for the last 10 minutes. I pressed my back against the stall wall and breathed carefully. When I looked up again, he was still there. He had stepped fully inside the stable now, and the morning light came through the doorway behind him, which did nothing to make him less imposing, and rather a great deal to illuminate the details I had not had the presence of mind to catalogue before. The scar, a thin, pale line that crossed from his left cheekbone toward his jaw, old enough to have settled into something that looked less like damage and more like a mark he'd simply always carried. The braids pulled back from his face, gathered with iron rings, the rest of his black hair loose against his shoulders. The blue of his eyes, which was not the soft blue of a winter sky, but the blue of deep water in a cold river, the kind that looks still on the surface and moves very fast underneath. He was the Alpha King. I had not needed to be told. The moment I had seen him in that doorway, something in me, some instinct that exists beneath thought and language, in the oldest and quietest part of what an Omega is, had simply known. And yet he was looking at me as though I were the confusing one. "You're the serving girl?" he said. It was not a question designed to diminish. It was the question of someone genuinely trying to orient themselves, the way you might say you're the one who sent the message, or you're the one who found it first, with a slight, involuntary emphasis on you that conveyed genuine recalibration. "I serve at the tavern, yes," I said. "Alice." He studied me for another moment. Then his gaze moved briefly to the broken rake on the floor, to the overturned trough still draining water across the hay-strewn ground, to the welt already forming along my left side where I had been shoved into the wall. I could feel it tightening, a deep ache that would be properly miserable by nightfall. "You were fighting 3 armed men," he said, "alone." "Brennan was here," I said, and then immediately felt the inadequacy of that, given that Brennan was 60 and had spent the duration pressed against a door. A very slight change occurred in the Alpha King's expression. Not quite a smile, more like the shape of one, the suggestion of it, quickly resolved back into neutral. "So you were," he said, "alone." I didn't argue further. Behind me, Brennan had finally unstuck himself from the wall and was making his way forward on his bad leg, his expression cycling rapidly between lingering terror and the specific social panic of a tavern keeper who has just realized that the Alpha King of the entire realm is standing in his stable. "My lord," he said, and the bow he attempted was more of a pained lurch. "My lord, the Crow and Kettle is honored, deeply honored. We had no notice of your passage, forgive us. We would have prepared. We travel without announcement for reasons," the king said, not unkindly. Your establishment will not be penalized for the lack of preparation. We require water for the horses and a brief rest before we continue north. Of course, Pip Rennet. Move, boys, bring water, bring the good oats. Brennan was already limping toward the far side of the stable, waving his arms, and the two boys scrambled up from their corner, with the explosive energy of people very grateful to have something to do. The stable filled with movement and noise again, the particular organized chaos of a traveling party settling in, soldiers leading their horses toward the troughs, the low murmur of men who have been riding since before dawn and want water and a moment off their feet. I should have gone back to the kitchen. Marta would be looking for me. The morning meal wasn't finished, and there were still travelers at the outer tables who would want their stew. I had dropped the iron pots somewhere in the courtyard in my rush to get to the stable, and they were probably cold by now. I had work to do. I always had work to do. I was picking my way toward the stable door when a voice, not the king's, a different one, rougher and edged with dry amusement, said, "You're limping." I stopped. The man who had spoken was leaning against the stable wall to my left, arms crossed, watching me with the alert, assessing gaze of someone who has spent considerable time learning to read people quickly. He was younger than the king by perhaps 5 years, with brown hair cut short and a gamma's build, leaner, faster-looking, built for speed rather than force, and the kind of face that probably got him underestimated in the same moment it was being memorized. "I'm not," I said, which was only partially true. The ache in my side was affecting my gait more than I'd realized. "You are," he said, marginally. "Left side." He tilted his head. "That's where Denas hit you, isn't it? The one by the trough." I looked at him steadily. "I don't know his name." "We do," he said, and left the weight of that sitting in the air between us. Then he pushed off the wall and offered, in a tone that managed to be both casual and entirely genuine, "Ren, I ride as the King's Gamma commander." He paused. "You were impressive in there." I didn't know what to do with that either. People did not often call me impressive. People called me useful sometimes on good days. They called me quiet. They called me too slight, too pale, too soft for the world she'd ended up in. "I was improvising," I said. "Most of the best fighting is," Ren said. I was going to respond to that when the morning air shifted. That same quality of pressure I had felt earlier, but closer now, and coming from directly behind me. I turned. The Alpha King had crossed the stable while I was speaking with Ren, and he was closer than I had expected. Not inappropriately so, but close enough that I had to look up to meet his eyes, which I was not prepared for because up close they were even more unnerving. Still water. Cold river. Something moving underneath. "Your side," he said. "Let the healer look at it." "It's a bruise," I said. "You don't know that." "I've had bruises before." Something in his expression tightened slightly. Not anger. More like the look of someone encountering an argument they find baffling for reasons they haven't yet articulated. "You were injured defending a property that isn't yours," he said, "against men who had no right to be there. The least this company can offer is a healer's assessment." I opened my mouth to decline again, and then I made the mistake of taking a slightly deeper breath, and the ache in my left side spiked sharply enough to stop whatever I was going to say. His gaze dropped to my side for just a fraction of a second, then back to my face. "Ren," he said, without looking away from me. "Find Oswin." Ren had already gone. I stood in the middle of the stable with the King of Aldenmore, looking at me with that expression I couldn't decipher. Not pity, not condescension, not the performative concern of someone who wants to be seen being generous. Something quieter than any of those things, something that felt, uncomfortably, like it might be the beginning of interest. And I realized, with the slow certainty of water finding its level, that my morning had gone somewhere I had not remotely anticipated. Outside, I heard one of the soldiers say something, low and rough, to another. Something that sounded like, "Did you see the Omega?" And the other one, alone. She was fighting them alone. The stable went quiet around those words. And Caius, Alpha King of Aldenmoor, said nothing at all, but he did not look away. Oswin was a small man with enormous hands, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades deciding what was worth worrying about and what was not. He found me sitting on an overturned crate near the stable entrance. Where the light was better, he said, though I suspected the real reason was that it placed me in full view of the courtyard, and therefore, in full view of anyone who happened to be watching from a distance. He pressed careful fingers along my left side through the fabric of my dress, asked me to breathe in twice, watched my face while I did it, and then sat back on his heels with the expression of a man confirming something he had already suspected. 2 ribs, he said, bruised, not broken. You'll feel it for a fortnight. I've felt worse, I said. He looked at me over the edge of his examining gaze, the particular look of a healer who has heard that sentence too many times, and has long since stopped being surprised by it, and only slightly stopped being saddened. I don't doubt it, he said, and began wrapping a length of linen around my midsection with practiced efficiency. Keep it supported. Don't lift anything heavier than a cup for 3 days. I thought about the iron pots I had been carrying when the morning started. I said nothing. When Oswin finished and moved away to tend to a soldier who had taken a stone to the ankle during the previous day's ride, I sat for a moment with my hands in my lap and watched the courtyard. The king's company was substantial, 40 soldiers at least, perhaps more, in the dark leather and iron of Aldenmoor's royal guard. Their horses, the kind of large, well-fed animals that spoke of a kingdom that took its cavalry seriously. There were 2 men who carried the look of advisors or nobles, older, finely cloaked despite the travel dust, speaking to each other in low voices near the far wall. And there was Wren, the Gamma commander, who was simultaneously supervising the watering of the horses and conducting what appeared to be a quiet inventory of the 3 captured raiders' possessions, with the focused attention of someone collecting information rather than trophies. The Alpha King himself had stepped back outside the stable. I could see him from where I sat, standing at the edge of the courtyard near the road, his back to the tavern, looking north toward the hills. His fur mantle moved in the cold morning wind. He was very still in the way that large, powerful things are still when they are thinking. Not idle, not resting, but processing something with the whole of his attention turned inward. I wondered what he was thinking about. I told myself it was not my business. You should eat something. I startled. Marta had appeared beside me with the silent efficiency she deployed whenever she felt someone needed managing and hadn't asked for it. She was a broad woman with iron-gray hair and forearms like a blacksmith, and she had the unique ability to make kindness feel like a directive. In her hands was a wooden bowl of the morning stew, which she pressed into my grip before I could object. Marta, I said, I have tables. Pip is managing the tables, she said. Eat. I ate. The stew was good, root vegetables and salt pork and something with herbs that Marta kept in unlabeled clay jars and guarded like treaty documents. Around me, the courtyard had settled into the particular rhythm of a large group pausing, subdued voices, the occasional clank of equipment being adjusted, the soft sounds of horses drinking. After a few minutes, Marta sat down on the crate beside mine. This was unusual. Marta did not sit down during daylight hours, unless something had compelled her to. The soldiers are talking about you, she said. I looked at my bowl. They'll stop. They're not talking badly, she said, and her tone was measured in the way she was when she was trying to give me information she thought I needed, and was uncertain how I would receive it. They're saying you fought 3 armed men to protect the grain stores in Brennan. Brennan needed protecting, I said. Alice. She waited until I looked up at her. Her eyes, brown and steady and full of the particular warmth of someone who had known me long enough to see past the deflections, held mine. You could have run inside and bolted the kitchen door. I know. But you didn't. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the king is staying through the midday meal. His Gamma commander has already spoken to Brennan about it. She paused. They'll need food. I understood. I set the half-finished bowl aside, earning a disapproving look that I acknowledged and ignored, and pushed myself to my feet, with only a slight hitch of breath from my wrapped ribs. Work was familiar. Work was something I knew how to do. The midday meal at the Crow and Kettle was not normally a formal affair. Travelers took what was available, bread, whatever was in the pot, pickled things from the cellar, and ate standing or at the rough outer benches if the weather was mild enough. But Marta had apparently decided that the Alpha King's presence constituted an occasion, and she had been in the kitchen for the better part of 2 hours, producing things I had not previously known our stores were capable of producing. A roasted joint of mutton, a grain porridge sweetened with dried plums, flatbread still warm from the hearthstone, a hard cheese from the cellar that Brennan usually saved for special negotiations. I carried it all without complaint, making trip after trip from the kitchen to the long interior table where the king and his senior men had settled. Wren sat at the king's right, and the 2 noble-looking advisors flanked him on the left. A Gamma named Aldrich, older than Wren, with a scar across his throat that suggested a story I did not ask about, sat nearest the door. I kept my movements efficient, and my eyes down. This was the correct posture. This was what was expected. What I did not expect was for the king to speak to me. Not to the table, generally. Not in the way that powerful men sometimes address the air around a serving girl without looking at her directly. But to me, specifically, pausing mid-conversation with one of his advisors to say, as I set the bread platter at his end of the table, "How is your side?" I straightened. "Manageable, my lord." "Thank you." He looked at me for a moment with that same unreadable quality from the stable. "Oswin said 2 bruised ribs." He did. "And you are carrying platters." "The platters need carrying," I said. Beside him, Wren made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, quickly converted into a cough. The advisor on the king's left, a gray-bearded man named, I had gathered, Lord Vial, glanced between me and the king with the expression of someone recalibrating a social situation. "You are from Vernholt originally?" the king asked. "No, my lord. I came to Vernholt 4 years ago." "From where?" I hesitated. Not because the answer was shameful, or rather, not only because of that, but because it was not the kind of answer that led anywhere comfortable. "The eastern settlements," I said, "near the Ashfin border." Something shifted in his expression. The Ashfin border was not a comfortable reference. It was the edge of the kingdom's most contested territory, where the boundary between Aldenmore and the neighboring dominion of Ashfin had been disputed in varying degrees of violence for the better part of 2 generations. The eastern settlements were small, frequently isolated, and had borne more than their share of that dispute's consequences. He did not ask what had brought me from there to here. Perhaps he guessed. Perhaps he simply recognized the quality of a question that a person has already answered sufficiently by still being alive. "The man you struck with the ladle," he said instead. "You aimed for his hand, not his head, not his arm. His hand." "He was holding Brennan," I said. "I needed him to let go." That was precise thinking under pressure. I didn't know what to do with that. I set the last piece of bread on the platter and kept my hands moving, because my hands always knew what to do, even when the rest of me was uncertain. "I wasn't thinking precisely," I said honestly. "I was thinking about Brennan." "That is what precise thinking under pressure looks like," the king said, "when it's real, rather than trained." Lord Vial was watching this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Not disapproval, exactly, but the careful attention of someone noting something down in an internal ledger. I picked up the empty tray and stepped back from the table. "Is there anything else your company requires, my lord?" The king looked at me for one more moment, that quality of stillness, that thing moving underneath. And then he looked back at the table. "Not at present," he said. "Thank you, Alice." My name, in his voice, sounded different than it did anywhere else. I did not examine why. I went back to the kitchen, Marta was waiting with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who had been watching through the kitchen doorway and had several opinions about what she had seen. "He knows your name," she said. "I told him my name," I said, "this morning. Kings don't remember the names of serving girls." I began stacking the empty pots. "Then perhaps he is simply polite." Marta looked at me for a long moment. "Alice," she said finally, very quietly, "be careful." I looked up. Her expression was not warning exactly. It was the particular face of someone who loves you and cannot decide whether what they are watching is danger or something else entirely, and is afraid of being wrong in either direction. "I am always careful," I said. She made a sound that suggested she found this deeply unconvincing and went back to her hearth. Outside, through the small kitchen window that faced the courtyard, I could see the king's soldiers beginning to prepare for departure. Horses were being resaddled, packs were being secured. The captured raiders had been bound and would travel, I understood, to the nearest lord's garrison for judgment. The midday meal was ending. The company would leave. Things would go back to what they had been before. I told myself this was fine. I had lived 4 years in the quiet of Vernholt, and I knew how to find comfort in the familiar weight of ordinary days. I did not need anything to be different. I was almost entirely convinced of this when Wren appeared in the kitchen doorway, with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who has been sent with a message and finds the errand mildly entertaining. "The king wants to speak with you," he said, "before we ride." I set down the pot I was holding. "Why?" I asked. Wren smiled, brief and genuine and a little crooked. "I suspect," he said, "that if he wanted you to know that before you got there, he would have sent a longer message." He was standing near the old oak at the far edge of the courtyard, the one whose roots had long since broken through the stone paving and whose branches spread wide enough in summer to shade half the yard. The leaves had mostly fallen now, leaving only a few brittle remnants that turned slowly in the cold wind, catching the pale afternoon light before releasing it. His soldiers were preparing to ride. The noise of it, the clank and shuffle and low voices of men and horses making ready, created a kind of privacy around the stillness where he stood, the way a river's current makes an island quieter by surrounding it with sound. I crossed the courtyard with my hands loose at my sides and my breathing careful and controlled, because my ribs were reminding me of their condition with every step, and I was determined not to let that show. He turned before I reached him, which meant he had heard me, or sensed me, in the way that alphas sometimes did. That quality of awareness that extended slightly beyond the ordinary range of the senses and could be unnerving if you weren't accustomed to it. I was not accustomed to it. I stopped a respectful distance away and waited. "Walk with me," he said. It was not quite a command. The phrasing was too mild for that. But it was not quite a request either. It occupied the space between, the kind of thing that very powerful people say when they have largely forgotten the difference between the two, and are not being deliberately overbearing about it, simply speaking from a lifetime of being listened to. I walked with him. We moved toward the edge of the property where the courtyard gave way to the beginning of the Thornfield Road, and the village opened up beyond, a scatter of stone cottages with thatched roofs trailing smoke. The mill at the far end of the main path, the well at the center where 2 women had paused their morning tasks to watch the king's company with the wide, uncertain eyes of people trying to decide whether to be impressed or afraid. "How long have you been at the tavern?" he asked. 4 years, I said. "Since I was 22. And before that, the eastern settlements near Ashven." He said it carefully, not prodding, but leaving space for the shape of whatever had happened there to be filled in if I chose. I chose, carefully. My village was caught in a territorial dispute. One of the smaller ones, nothing that would have reached the capital's attention. There was a season of difficulty, and then most of the people I knew were gone or scattered. I kept my voice even. I walked west. Vernholt was where I stopped. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between us, carrying the smell of pine and turned earth and the coming cold of deeper autumn. "You were alone when you arrived here," he said. Not a question. "I have been alone for most of the last 4 years," I said. "It's not as uncommon as people think, for Omegas from border territories." He glanced at me, a sideways thing, brief, but with that quality of attention that made even brief glances feel thorough. "You say that without bitterness." "I feel it sometimes," I said honestly, "but bitterness is heavy. I've found that things which are heavy slow you down when you need to move quickly." He stopped walking. I stopped beside him, and when I looked up, I found him regarding me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not the unreadable stillness from the stable, not the measured assessment from the table, but something more open than either of those. The face of someone encountering a thought they had not expected and are still in the process of deciding what to do with it. "That is," he said slowly, "an unusually clear way of seeing." "It took a long time to find it," I said. We stood for a moment at the edge of the road. Down the path, I could see the village blacksmith, a large beta named Croft, who was usually unimpressed by everything, standing in his doorway watching the royal soldiers with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "The men you fought this morning," Caius said. "They were not the first trouble to pass through Vernholt recently." I looked at him. "No. We have been tracking a pattern of raids along the secondary roads. Small operations, no house affiliation, hitting supply stores and grain sellers specifically." His jaw set slightly. "Someone is coordinating them, systematically depleting the villages along the northern routes before the first hard snow." The implications of that settled over me slowly, the way cold does. First at the surface, then deeper, until it reaches something that cannot be warmed easily. "Starving the villages," I said, "before winter." "We're testing a method," he said. "We don't yet know which." "Does it matter which, if the result is the same?" He looked at me again. That expression again. That recalibration. "No," he said. "You're right. It doesn't." I turned that information over in my mind. The 3 men this morning had not seemed organized enough to be part of something larger. They had the look of opportunists, not soldiers. But opportunists could still be directed, if the direction was simple enough. Take what is stored. Leave nothing for winter. You didn't need disciplined men for that. You needed willing ones. "There are 3 other villages within a half-day's ride of Vernholt," I said. "Mossbridge, Calvert's Mill, and the settlement they call the Hollow. It doesn't have an official name. All 3 use the secondary roads. All 3 have grain stores they've been building since harvest." He was watching me with complete attention now. "If someone is moving along the secondary routes systematically," I continued, "Vernholt was not their first stop. And if they follow the road logic, Mossbridge would be next. It's the only one with a proper cellar deep enough to store through a hard winter. The others cache above ground." A silence followed that was different from the ones before it. More charged. The kind of silence that happens when information lands somewhere it matters. "How do you know the storage layouts of 3 neighboring villages?" he asked. "I carry supplies between them sometimes when Brennan sends me," I said. "And people talk in taverns. They talk about what they're afraid of losing." Wren had appeared at the edge of the courtyard without my noticing. I was beginning to understand that this was simply something he did, and was watching us from a distance with an expression that was carefully composed into blankness and therefore extremely expressive. Caius turned to him. "Send a rider to Mossbridge, and to Calvert's Mill. I want the secondary road between here and the northern pass covered through the week." Wren nodded once and moved away with efficient speed. The king turned back to me. Something had shifted in the geometry of the conversation. It felt more direct now, more deliberate, as though we had moved past a threshold neither of us had explicitly acknowledged crossing. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." I waited. "If you had not been in that courtyard this morning," he said, "if you had been inside, or asleep, or simply elsewhere, what would have happened?" I considered the question with the honesty he had asked for. "Brennan would have opened the grain cellar," I said. "He is brave in the ways that come naturally to someone who has built something and cannot bear to see it ruined. But he is 60 and alone, and he would have chosen to survive over losing everything. So he would have given them what they wanted." I paused. "And then they probably would have taken the horses as well, because men like that rarely stop at what they came for when there is more to be had and no reason not to take it." "And the boys in the stable?" "Yes," I said quietly. "And the boys." He absorbed this. "You knew all of that," he said, "in the moment you went through that door. I knew enough of it, and you went anyway." "Someone had to," I said. And then, because honesty had apparently become the standard of this conversation, and I genuinely thought, that if I could make enough noise and enough trouble, they might decide I wasn't worth the effort. "That is not what happened," he said. "No," I agreed. "It is not what happened." Something in his expression shifted again. That quality of movement beneath the stillness, like the current under cold water, and this time it did not resolve back into neutral as quickly as it had before. "My company is riding north," he said. "There is a matter at the border garrison at Crestfall that requires my direct attention, and then I return to the capital." He paused. "The road passes through Mossbridge." I understood the shape of what he was saying before he completed it. "I am asking," he said, and the slight deliberateness with which he chose that word rather than any other told me he was aware of the distinction. "Whether you would consent to travel with my company as far as Mossbridge. Your knowledge of the secondary routes and the village layouts is useful. Useful. The word I had always been given. But the way he said it was different from the way it was usually said. Not useful and therefore tolerable, or useful and therefore permissible. But useful the way a navigator is useful on a difficult sea passage. As though the usefulness were a quality of genuine value rather than a justification for presence. I thought about Marta. The kitchen. The iron pots and the morning stew and the 4 years of ordinary quiet days. I thought about the 3 men in the stable. The pattern of raids along the secondary roads. The villages that didn't know what was coming for their winter stores. I thought about Brennan, who would have opened that cellar door. "I would need to speak with Brennan and Marta first," I said, "and I would need a horse, as I do not have one." The suggestion of a smile, that same shape of it from the stable, almost there, and then not, passed across his face. "Both are manageable," he said. "Then yes," I said. "I consent." He held my gaze for 1 moment longer. "We ride within the hour," he said. He turned and walked back toward his company. I stood at the edge of the Thornfield Road for a moment, with the cold wind turning the last oak leaves above me and the sounds of the village carrying faintly from down the path. And I felt, beneath the ache in my ribs and the residue of the morning's fear, and the very reasonable uncertainty about what I had just agreed to, something else. Something that felt, cautiously and quietly, like the first morning of a different life. Marta did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried. She was the kind of woman who stood very still and breathed through her nose and looked at a point slightly above your left shoulder when something moved her. And you understood what she was feeling by the quality of that stillness rather than by any outward expression of it. She stood that way when I told her. Then she said, "How long?" "A few days," I said. "To Mossbridge and back, most likely. Perhaps a little beyond." She looked at me directly then. The above-the-shoulder pretense abandoned. Her brown eyes were very clear, and very steady, and full of things she was deciding whether to say. "You could say no," she said finally. "To him. Even to a king." "I know," I said. "But you're not going to." No. Another silence. Then she crossed to the kitchen shelf where she kept the traveling provisions. The hard cheese, the wrapped salt pork, the dense rye bread that kept for days, and she began packing them into a cloth sack without being asked, her hands moving with the same efficient love they brought to everything she did. "Take the gray cloak," she said. "Not the brown one. The gray is warmer, and the hood actually stays up." I was already wearing the gray cloak. I pulled the hood up slightly to show her. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she pulled me into her arms, briefly, firmly, the embrace of someone who says things through contact that they cannot quite bring themselves to say aloud. And then she released me and turned back to the hearth with the air of someone who had decided that was enough. "Come back," she said to the fire. "I will," I said. Brennan was more openly emotional, which surprised me. He shook my hand with both of his and told me 3 times that I had been the best worker the Crow and Kettle had ever seen, which was generous given that I had dropped 2 pots of stew in the courtyard that very morning. And then I walked out into the pale autumn afternoon and joined the company of the Alpha King. The road north was wide enough for 4 horses abreast in the valleys, and narrowed to 2 where it climbed through the forested ridges. The King's company rode in organized columns, with scouts ahead and a rear guard behind, and somewhere in the middle of that formation rode a serving girl from Vernholt on a brown mare named, according to the stable boy who had saddled her, Nettle, for reasons that became apparent within the first hour when she attempted to bite my left boot with the cheerful persistence of an animal who has decided this is simply what she does. Wren rode beside me for most of the first afternoon. He was easy company, not in the sense of being simple or undemanding, but in the sense of someone who did not require you to perform comfort in order to be present. He talked sometimes and was quiet others, and both states felt equally natural. He told me about the campaign they were returning from. 3 weeks south of the Crestfall border, managing a dispute between 2 alpha lords whose territories shared a river and disagreed about whose side of it the salmon preferred. "And did you resolve it?" I asked. "The king resolved it," Wren said, by pointing out that the salmon didn't know which territory they were in, and therefore the dispute was primarily theoretical. Lord Davin found this less amusing than Lord Ferris did, but they both accepted the boundary clarification, rather than continue arguing in front of the Alpha King, which would have required them to admit they'd summoned him over fish. I laughed. Genuinely. The kind that came before I could decide whether it was appropriate, catching me off guard. Wren looked sideways at me with that crooked smile. "He does that," Wren said, more quietly. "Cuts through. Finds the thing everyone is performing around and simply names it." I thought about the stable. You were fighting 3 armed men. Alone. The way he had said it. Not dramatically, not to emphasize the contrast between my size and the situation, but simply to establish what was true. "How long have you ridden with him?" I asked. 12 years, Wren said. "Since before he was king." He paused, and something shifted in his tone. Not grief, exactly, but the weight of accumulated history. Since his father's time. Since things were different. I did not ask what different meant. I had learned, in 4 years of serving travelers at a Crossroads tavern, that there was a particular quality to how people said different when they meant harder, and that the kindest thing you could do was let the word stand without making them excavate what was beneath it. Aldrich, the older Gamma with the scar across his throat, rode on my other side for a portion of the afternoon. He was a man of very few words who deployed them with the precision of someone who had learned not to waste them. He told me, in 2 sentences, that he had grown up near the Ashfan border himself, a different region than mine, further north, and that he had walked west at 17. He did not say why. He did not need to. We understood each other in the way that people do when they have come from the same category of loss, even if the specific contents differ. We made camp before dark, in a clearing where the road widened near a stream. The soldiers moving through the familiar choreography of setting up a traveling camp with the ease of long practice. Fires appeared. Tents were raised. The smell of wood smoke and warming broth spread through the cold air. I helped where I could, carrying water from the stream, tending one of the smaller fires when the soldier assigned to it was called away. It felt natural to be useful. It always did. It was full dark when Caius found me. I was sitting near the stream, a little apart from the main camp, watching the water move in the firelight. My ribs ached steadily. The day's riding had not been kind to them, and I had been breathing shallowly since mid-afternoon without fully admitting it to myself. He settled on the ground near me without ceremony, not close, but near enough for conversation, his long legs extended and his forearms resting on his knees, and his gaze on the water the same way mine was. The informality of it startled me more than any grand gesture could have. We sat in silence for a little while. "Lord Vial thinks I have lost my judgment," he said eventually. I glanced at him. "Because of me?" "Because of several things. The fish dispute took longer than he thought it should. The detour through the secondary road. And now," he paused, "a serving girl from a border village riding north with the royal company." "Lord Vale is not wrong to notice that it's unusual," I said carefully. "He's not wrong about the observation," Caius said. "He is wrong about the conclusion." He turned to look at me, and in the firelight his blue eyes were darker, less cold water, more deep sky at the edge of evening. "I have been ruling this kingdom for 9 years. In that time I have sat in council with lords who have spent their entire lives learning to say nothing of value in as many words as possible. I have negotiated with neighboring kings who mistake performance for power. I have ridden through villages like this one and watched the people in them carry weight that no one in a castle ever lifts." He paused. "And I have rarely, genuinely rarely, encountered someone who thinks the way you think." I did not know what to say. I looked back at the stream. "You knew their method," he said. "The raiders. You understood the pattern in a moment that would have taken my advisors a meeting and 2 written reports to arrive at." "I just know these roads," I said, "and these people." "That is exactly what I mean," he said. The fire crackled behind us. Somewhere in the camp, one of the soldiers was singing, a low, rough traveling song, the kind that has too many verses and gets slower as the night gets deeper. "My kingdom has a problem," Caius said, and the shift in his tone made me turn back to him. He was looking at the water again, and there was something in his profile, in the set of his jaw and the particular weight behind his eyes, that I recognized because I had seen it before. Not on kings. On people who carry things alone for a very long time because they have decided that the weight belongs to them, and it would be wrong to set it down. "The raids are not random," he said, "and they are not simply winter opportunism. Someone with knowledge of this kingdom's supply routes, detailed knowledge, the kind that comes from inside, not outside, is coordinating them, and I do not yet know who." The implication was heavy and cold and settled over the space between us. "You suspect someone in your court," I said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I thought about what that meant. To rule a kingdom and suspect the people closest to you of working against the people furthest from you. To ride through villages watching the consequences of a betrayal you could not yet name or prove. To carry that alone, the way he was clearly carrying it. "That is a very heavy thing to be uncertain about," I said. "Yes," he said, simply. "Just that." We sat together in the dark beside the moving water, and I thought about Marta telling me to be careful, and Brennan shaking my hand 3 times, and the brown mare Nettle attempting to bite my boot, and all the small ordinary threads of the life I had built in 4 years of quiet days. And I thought about how life had a way of handing you the next thing before you had finished deciding what to do with the last one. "Alice," he said. I turned. He was looking at me with that expression I had been trying to read since the stable doorway, the one that moved beneath the stillness, the current under the cold water. And this time he did not look away from it. He let me see it. It was not command. It was not the assessment of a king deciding the value of a resource. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was loneliness, recognizing itself in someone else. I held his gaze. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The stream moved. The fire breathed. The soldier's song wound through its last slow verse and settled into silence. Then Caius said very quietly, "I am glad you were in that courtyard this morning." And I said, "So am I." What followed was not the end of things. It was, as I came to understand later, the beginning of them. We reached Mossbridge the following afternoon and found it untouched. The rider Wren had sent had arrived in time, and the village had secured its stores and its people behind barred doors at the first sight of the royal banner. The network of secondary road watchers that the king established in the days that followed proved, within the fortnight, to be what broke the raiding pattern entirely. 3 more coordinated groups were intercepted. And the information that unraveled from those interceptions led, eventually, to a name in the capital, a minor lord with debts and ambitions, and a very specific knowledge of the kingdom's supply routes that he had not come by honestly. I was not there when he was brought to judgment. By then I had returned to Vernholt, to Marta and Brennan, and the iron pots and the morning stew, carrying my bruised ribs and the memory of firelight on moving water, and a conversation that had changed the shape of something inside me that I had not known needed changing. Wren came to the Crow and Kettle 3 weeks later, officially on the king's business regarding the Road Watch network. He drank Marta's ale, and told me that Nettle had bitten another rider's boot, and that Aldrich had laughed for what Wren believed was only the 4th time in 12 years. He also brought a letter, sealed in dark wax with the king's mark. He set it on the table in front of me, and said nothing, and then looked very intently at the wall. I opened it. It was not long. Caius wrote the way he spoke, directly, without performance, finding the thing and naming it. He wrote that the capital's council had a gap in it, not a formal position, nothing with a title or a rank or a seat at the high table, because those things required bloodlines and politics and a great deal of the kind of maneuvering that neither of them, he suspected, had much patience for. But a gap, nonetheless. Someone who knew the roads, who understood what people were afraid of losing, who thought clearly under pressure and spoke honestly when asked to. He wrote that he was not commanding her to fill it. He wrote that he was asking. I read the letter twice. Then I set it down on the table and looked at the kitchen doorway, where Marta was standing with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had already read the situation in the quality of the silence, and was making her peace with it. "The gray cloak," she said. "Not the brown one." I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me, steady, warm, full of the love that expresses itself through practical advice and packed provisions, and turning back to the hearth before you can see it properly. "I'll come back," I said. "I know you will," she said. "But you'll be different when you do." She was right. She was almost always right. I picked up the letter. I folded it carefully and placed it inside my cloak, and then I went to find Wren, to tell him that the answer was yes. 6 months later, in the great hall of the capital, a council was concluding its session when the Alpha King gestured for the room to clear. All except one. The lords and advisors filed out with varying degrees of curiosity and concealed displeasure, and when the heavy doors closed, the hall held only the 2 of them. The king at the head of the long council table, and Alice of Vernholt, formerly of the eastern settlements, standing 3 seats down with her hands folded and her fair braid over one shoulder, and the expression of someone who has recently told 3 separate noble lords, politely but with absolute clarity, that their proposed solution to the secondary road problem was going to make things considerably worse. She had been right. She was. Caius had found, almost always right. Not in the way of someone performing cleverness, but in the way of someone who had spent a long time paying attention to things that other people considered beneath their notice. "Lord Vial lodged another objection today," Caius said. "I know," Alice said. He lodged it with me first. I believe he thought I would be intimidated. Were you? She considered this honestly. A little, she said. He is very tall, and he has excellent eyebrows, but I told him what I thought regardless. Something in Caius's expression, that movement beneath the stillness, that current under cold water, which she had learned over 6 months to read more clearly, settled into something warm and certain and no longer hidden. He stood and walked the length of the table until he was standing before her. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully. She recognized the phrasing. She had heard it once before, at the edge of a thornfield road on a cold autumn morning when everything had been uncertain and new. She looked up at him. I am asking, he said, deliberately, clearly, with the full weight of what he meant by the word. Whether you would stay, not for the roads, not for the council. For me. Alice held his gaze across the space between them. Outside the high windows, the Capitol moved and breathed and carried on with all its noise and politics and complexity. Inside, the fire burned low, and the candlelight was steady, and the hall was very quiet. She thought about a stable in Vernholt, an iron ladle, the weight of an ordinary life, and the moment she had decided not to retreat from a door. She thought about how the things you choose in fear sometimes turn out to be the bravest choices you ever make. Yes, she said. He reached out, careful, deliberate, and took her hand. They stood like that in the candlelit hall for a long moment, not speaking, because some things have already been said in the 12 months before the asking, in 100 small and careful conversations, in firelight by a stream, and in the margins of council sessions, and in the way two people look at each other when they have both been lonely for a long time and have finally, improbably, stopped. Marta received a letter some weeks after that, sealed in dark wax, in handwriting she did not recognize. Careful, unhurried, the hand of someone who has learned to say things directly. It told her that Alice was well, that she had stopped lifting things heavier than a cup only when absolutely necessary, and that her ribs had fully healed, that Lord Vial had come around mostly, and that Wren had been insufferably pleased about the whole situation from the beginning, that the secondary roads were safe now, watched and maintained, and that the villages along the northern routes had come through the winter with their stores intact. And at the end of the letter, in different handwriting, bolder, shorter, the hand of someone who does not often write personal correspondence and is doing it anyway. The Crow and Kettle is welcome at the Capitol. The ale is, I am told, better than ours. Marta read the letter at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window, and the smell of wood smoke and stew filling the air the same way it always had and always would. Then she folded it very carefully and placed it on the shelf above the hearth. She went back to her work, and she smiled, just once for a long time.